let me know when I need to. All right. Yeah. Okay, Director.
All right, we're just going to give a second for everyone to come into this webcast. Welcome everyone who's joining us today. So I am Rachel Quedno, Program Director at Strong Towns, and we're excited to be participating in this webcast today. I'm going to turn it over now to Andy Sisolak of the Delta Leadership Network, Illinois.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning and good day to everybody. My name is Andy Sisolak, and on behalf of Martin Rowe and DLN Illinois, welcome. We've got a number of groups today that are participating in this call, and I'd like to give them a little shout out. Of course, DLN Illinois, the Delta Leadership Network, the Southern Illinois Mayors Association. We have assorted chambers and planning groups from Southern Illinois on the call. We actually have some attendees of the Appalachian Regional Commission's Leadership Academy on the call today. And then, of course, our good friends at Ameren, Illinois that are also participating today. I'd also like to, again, thank the Delta Regional Authority, the Delta Leadership Network, and Ameren, Illinois for making today's event possible. And then just for the sake of social media, any of you that are members of the Delta Leadership Network, if you don't mind, sometime during the next hour and a half, selfishly take a selfie of you and or your group watching this event. I'd appreciate that, and we'll post that to Facebook later today or tomorrow. With that said, I'd like to introduce the CEO and founder of Strong Towns, Charles Marone.
Hey, everybody. Chuck is just fine.
Chuck.
Charles is great. It's so nice. It's so nice to be here. I know we had planned to do this in person earlier this year. And of course, the pandemic changed a lot of plans, not just that one. It's nice that we can reconstitute this in a virtual sense. I think also with a mindset towards getting together again in person at some point in the future. As you were introducing me, Andy, I realized I was drinking from my favorite glass, and I will just get this out of the way before we get too deeply into this. This is my favorite glass. It's a Minnesota Twins glass from Target Field, where tonight we will be beating up on the Cleveland Indians, which I think everybody listening is probably be happy with that. But then our next two series are against this little team called the Chicago White Sox and another team called the Chicago Cubs, which I'm guessing there may be a little friction. Both of those teams doing very well this year, by the way. So maybe we'll all be good and good friends. But I didn't want anybody to get triggered by my cup as I took a drink throughout this session. I'm an engineer. I'm a planner. I started Strong Towns back in 2008. Really as a way to talk about my experiences doing engineering and planning work. I started writing a blog. That blog grew into this broader conversation about how we build cities that are financially strong and resilient. Today, our site reaches over 2 million people a year with our content. We do 2-3 articles a day. We have 3 different podcast streams. We do events and now in the pandemic do broadcasts such as this to reach people and share our message. One of the things that happened to us very early on in this pandemic, and know that as a team, there's a bunch of us were at a retreat. We all work remotely around the country. So we got together a couple times a year and we were all at Disney World actually, having our retreat when all the stuff started flashing on the screen. NBA season canceled, NCAA season canceled, Tom Hanks has COVID, and you know, nobody knew at the time what this would mean, what the impact of this would be. We cut our retreat early, everybody went home, and kind of very shortly after that, we started to get inundated, quite frankly, with people asking us, okay, what do we do? The implications of this are unclear, but there are some things that are very clear. If we shut down our economy, every city is going to be struggling. If we shut down our places, every small business is going to be hurting. If we have an extended period of lockdown, how are people going to get food? How are people going to get shelter? How are we going to like function as an economy? How are we going to do these things? For years at Strong Towns, we've kind of played a long game. We've talked about the distortions in our development pattern, the things that we have done that have made our cities financially fragile. Now, all of a sudden, we have this acute thing in front of us where we have to react in real time to actually solve problems. And so what we came up with was something we call the Local Leaders Toolkit. It's a way of thinking your way through this pandemic and our response to it, and setting ourselves up to become stronger, healthier, more prosperous as part of the process. We put this into a written document. In fact, I've got a copy of it right here. So it's available for download and printing and sharing. I'm going to give you that web address here at the end so anybody who's listening can get a copy of this toolkit. Before we get into what is in this toolkit and some of the ideas and thoughts that we're putting as part of this conversation, I want to pause a moment because we talk about this in the early part of the toolkit, but I want to focus on it now. We draw a distinction between people who are leaders and people who are managers. And we draw this distinction not to suggest that one is good and one is bad. I think there are times for both. There are times when you need great leadership. There's times when you need great managers. There's times when you need visionary people who are going to break rules. There's times when you need people who are going to deliver on time, on budget, on schedule. This is one of the times when we need to lean into the leadership side of this as opposed to the manager side of this. And from that sense, we wanted to draw a couple distinctions here. Leaders are people who have followers. Managers have subordinates. They have people they manage and take care of. Leaders have to be able to go out in front and like look around and have people coming along behind them. Leaders break rules. They break rules responsibly, but they break rules. Managers administer guidelines. They are more attuned to like painting within the lines. This is a time now where we need people who responsibly, and we're not talking irresponsibly, but responsibly are going to break rules and push some boundaries. Leaders are going to encourage those around them to take risks and to be bold and to be daring and to push boundaries. Managers have a tendency to play it safe. Again, sometimes we need good managers. Sometimes we need people who play it safe. This is not one of those times. Leaders sell a vision. Managers sell individual projects. Leaders in times of stress see opportunities. Managers fret over potential failures. At this point in time, when we're undergoing this huge transition, this thing that, as a world, we haven't experienced at this level anywhere near this for over a century. As human beings, alive today, none of us have really experienced this in any real practical sense. We're going through something completely different. And those situations call for great leaders. And so part of our Local Leaders Toolkit is right off the bat to encourage those leaders to step up. Now is your time. Now is the time that we need you, your communities need you, and we're calling on you to be the leader that you were meant to be. So this toolkit, we separate things into phases. An immediate phase, like an acute phase, like the things are on fire, there's an emergency phase, what do we do? A second phase, a 2 to 12 month phase of now we're part of a transition, now we're part of something that we're shifting to something new, a metamorphosis kind of phase, what do we do here? And then beyond that, what are we setting ourselves up for? How are we gonna think differently? How are we gonna act differently? I think a good way to deal with all crises is in this pattern. What do I have to do right now to get through this? Where am I going in the future? And then how do I transition to that, from where we're at today to that? So we've set this toolkit up in that way, and I'm going to deliver this conversation in that way as well. When we look at the first 60 days, when we think about an immediate response to stress, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's any other big issue that we're facing, we have some shifts in mental thinking that leaders need to make right off the bat to be effective leaders in a time like this. The first one is that leadership one. Step up, fill this void. Uh, I don't want to get bogged down in a conversation about, federal leadership, Trump, Biden, Democrats, Republicans. Have we botched this? I think it's very clear from the local level, from us experiencing this in our cities, in our communities, in our places, that there has been a leadership void, and at best we can say a clumsy response. Part of that is just inherent to a pandemic. Some of this, nobody knew what was coming. We didn't know how this would play out. We didn't know. There were people who had theories and thoughts and ideas, but especially in the early days, the models were very complex. There were a lot of unknowns. There were a lot of variables. What has happened, and in the places we've seen do best in response, are places where people step up and fill that leadership void and say, we're not going to wait for someone to come and lead us. We're actually going to step up and do that. We need to, at the local level, local leaders begin orienting themselves horizontally as opposed to vertically. We often today situate local governments, and by extensions, the communities that they serve, at the bottom of a vertical, you can think of it as like a chain of governments. You have, federal government, you have state government, you have regional government, then you have city government. And some people will put, global organizations at the top of that, but there's a hierarchy there, and local government sits at the bottom. And oftentimes when we work with local government, it's very natural to kind of orient ourselves up that chain. That's where money comes from. That's where capital flows come from. If we can tap into Wall Street, if we can tap into the bond market, if we can tap into state and federal grants, that's the way we do things. We need to reorient as part of this pandemic, not to see ourselves as the bottom rung in a ladder, a hierarchy of governments, but we need to orient ourselves horizontally towards the people in our communities, towards their urgent needs, and see ourselves not at the bottom rung, but as the highest level of coordination within a community of people. Be a voice of unity. And I say this, it kind of goes without saying that if you want to be a leader at the local level, places where you're going to meet people and know your neighbors, and you can't be a divisive personality. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work in the long term. But I think even going beyond not being divisive, to actually take the next step and be a voice of unity, one who works very hard to not use partisan language, to not frame things in ways that needlessly turn people off or turn people away, to take those steps to try to be not just like, and I'm not saying a happy voice, a positive voice, but I'm saying someone who recognizes that within a community trying to get stuff done, we need people who are going to, in the context of our big top-down left-right culture war debate, at the local level have to work together to get things done. We need those people. So be that voice of unity. And then finally, seize the moment. We need, local leadership, and local leadership needs to drive our pandemic response. And so step up and be that leader. In very specific sense, we set out 8 things that we need to do at the local level immediately to get things secure and to get things moving. And it just occurred to me, Rachel, you forgot to remind me. It's okay. I won't blame you, because I'm at least 50% responsible for this. There is a Q&A button in this session. If you have a question at any point as we go in here, feel free to enter your question in the Q&A. Rachel is going to field those. And at the end, her and I are going to have a conversation and try to answer as many of those as we can. So if you have a question as we go, feel free to use that Q&A button to get it in. You don't have to wait till the very end to do that. So immediately, we need to get people fed. We need to get people shelter. This is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, this is what people need. That doesn't necessarily mean that the local government needs to go out and feed people. It doesn't necessarily mean that the local government needs to go out and provide housing. There are lots of organizations, civic organizations, religious, secular, all across the board that are doing this type of work and doing it really well. In my community, it's been the school district that has really done the most work to get people fed. The local government can become a coordinating part of this, local leaders can step up and fill that void. What we're really talking about here is, are we as a community taking care of the people in our place? This is an immediate need. Third, support the public health response, particularly in the early days, but I think even so now as things go on and as the complexities of this pandemic start to interact with each other and feedback, is there going to be a second wave? What does school openings mean? All of these things are great unknowns that we're walking into. And when we say support the public health response, we're not talking about like blindly following the public health response, but being a player at the table, an advocate for your community, an advocate for the needs of people in your places. Remember, we're orienting horizontally, so we're getting ourselves very in touch with what's going on within our own communities. And I think more than anything, the places that I've seen be really successful have had local leaders within government, throughout the community, being able to say things like, hey, we don't know. We've never dealt with this before. This is brand new. Here's what we think might happen, and here's what kind of our best estimates project, but we don't really know. And so we're going to take prudent steps. We're going to work on this together, and we're going to keep lines of communication open. I think as local leaders, we can kind of, in times of uncertainty, spearhead that notion that there are reasonable risks we can take and reasonable things we can do, and kind of, help people understand that, we are dealing with an uncertain situation. We're going to have to feel our way through this together. I wrote in here, and it's interesting because this has really become the issue in some places. Connect mass to economic recovery. I did a whole podcast on masks back in March. But before the CDC was even recommending that people wear masks, ironically, we have this long and very kind of tortured path we've woven over the last few months regarding masks. In the early days of this pandemic, we were telling people at the local level, not only wear your mask because it's like the easiest way to, from a public health standpoint, to not transmit this virus or just slow the spread of it. But particularly, it is the way we get the economy going. It is the way we get small businesses working. It is the way we get people back to work. You can see very early on, all the corporations figured this out. Costco here in town, Target, Walmart, they all said, if you want to come in the store, you got to have a mask. All the fast food places, all the the national food chains, they figured this out right away, and they're like, use the drive-through, call in, and use our app and go pick things up. We'll bring it out to your car. They were all very quick on this because they recognized that they couldn't get bogged down in a debate over whether masks work or they don't work, whether what kind of mask you should have, that kind of thing. They said, if we're going to get things moving, we got to get beyond that. So let's just do it. Let's just get beyond that. Let's just bite the bullet, and we'll figure out the health and the science part of it later. Unfortunately, what we see is that the people who have been most impacted by our dysfunctional debate over this have been the small businesses, the small business owners, the individual franchisees, the people who cut hair, the people who do, fill in the gap, all those people who, are not getting the bailouts, are not getting the low interest rate money, are not getting all the stuff that kind of the top-down economy has come to the rescue with. If we want to help these people, if we want to keep them working, we have to work very hard to not allow the issue of masks to be politicized, to focus our efforts and our energies when we talk about masks, when we talk about public health, when we talk about things. Everybody can have different opinions on the virus itself and the impact that it's going to have and whether we should be worried or not worried. But we have to be on the same page in terms of our commitment to keeping our local economy going, and as masks being like the vehicle that will allow us to do that. I always like to point out, I get the debate over masks, and it makes sense. Like I understand it, and I respect in many ways the entire conversation. It's one of those things, and this is what I said early in March. The downside of wearing a mask as an individual is actually very small. The potential upside in terms of benefit to us as a community is very large. Anytime you have something like that, where there's an asymmetry in that direction, those are things that we have to aggressively pursue. And so please connect your mask to economic recovery. It's the best way to get your local economy going. We need to provide people space. And it's interesting now as we're entering into the fall, because I feel like we struggled with this at the beginning. You had people getting, arrested and handcuffed for meeting in a park, distance from other people. You had people who, were getting harassed for going to the beach, staying spread out from everybody else. I feel like we figured this out a little bit. There's a mental health aspect to when you keep people locked up and cooped up in a space and don't let them out. It has a very nasty effect on them. We actually need to provide people safe space in order to get out, do things. Often that means taking space that is no longer being used for the use and the intent that we originally had. Think parking lots, think extra street lanes, think parking spaces. Taking that space and actually dedicating it to providing space for people to spread out. There's a lot of great success stories early on of cities doing this really well and very successfully, and providing people a safe outlet so that they can keep their mental health in order, so that they could get out and be human, which is really what the stress of this pandemic demands. Along with that, the idea of going easy on enforcement. There is no police state that will get us to compliance with social distancing and with all the things that need to go on. There really isn't. But there's a lot that we can do just with the idea of helping each other out. Use your enforcement process as a way to educate people, as a way to bring people on board, as a way to help people recognize, particularly at the local level, particularly at like the community level. I may not, from Minnesota, identify with someone who's struggling in New York or in Texas or in California, but I can certainly identify with my neighbor across the street or the person up the road. Let's just lean into that for the time being and say, hey, we're all in this together. Here's how we can help each other and help our community be stronger and better off. Support adaptation. I think it's important to note that particularly when we get to small businesses, we don't oftentimes as local leaders have answers for them. We don't know how long this is going to go on. We don't know what kind of stress they're going to go through. We don't know what their market's going to be. We don't understand their business. What we can do as a community, as leaders, is support the idea that they need to figure this out. And that means they, as leaders, as entrepreneurs, are going to have to responsibly break rules, color outside the lines, push the boundaries. And instead of having, I think, what is a normal reaction sometimes to people who are innovating and doing things different, which is to say, well, hold on a sec. Have you got the proper permits? Have you gone to the right place? Have you crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's? We can be proactive in helping them adapt, helping them change, helping them figure this out. At the local level, particularly within city governments, especially if we have people who are not being fully utilized because they're working from home or what have you, we can collect data. We can collect tons of data. I saw places in the early parts of this pandemic that were calling their small businesses saying, where are you struggling? What are you hurting with? What things are happening to you right now? And trying to understand in a very personal sense what is going on. And then we recommend to cities that they just preserve their cash. And I'm going to talk about that here briefly because I think there's a natural, like, liberal conservative kind of notion about, the role of government and preserving cash and freezing hiring and all these things that kind of happen in difficult times. I'm not wanting to have that conversation. You're going to have that conversation somewhere else. What I'm talking about is a very pragmatic approach to understanding your business environment and your local kind of economic ecosystem. because we don't know how long this will go on, because we don't know the ramifications, because we don't know the impact, there are two kind of truths that we have to understand. First of all, the local government can't fail. It not only can't fail because it's just not going to be allowed to fail, but it, in a metaphorical sense, can't fail. Like if the local government fails, if we don't have cash, if we don't have money, if we can't keep the doors open, if we can't do the base things we need to do, lots and lots of people are going to suffer. If we can't plow the snow off the roads, if we can't keep the streets clean, if we can't pick up the garbage, if we can't do like the things we need to do to serve this broader community, this community is gonna be suffering in deep ways. The second truth is that we don't know what local businesses are going to emerge from this. We don't know ultimately how long it will take, what assistance is going to be provided them from other places, what innovations there will be that will allow them to operate. The idea of taking money from our local government system, in a sense, because there's a panic, there's a, and essentially like throwing that money at an economic ecosystem just to say we did something. And trust me, we saw dozens and dozens of places doing that exact same thing. To me is self-defeating. As local governments, we need to save our cash. We need to be in a position to sustain, to withstand whatever comes our way, and be kind of that rock, that foundation, so that people can rely on us to do what we're doing and do it well and do it competently. We're not going to be able to save everything. And so the idea of kind of like blindly running around, throwing money at this problem and that problem, when we ourselves as an institution, local governments themselves are financially really, really fragile, is just reckless and irresponsible. And so let's take a more, particularly as we respond to this in the short term, a more pragmatic approach, a more long-term thoughtful approach. As we shift through that initial stage then, and we get to the second part, we've got additional shifts in thinking we need to make. I think the most important one, and one that is hard for us to get our minds around, but we need to spend some time thinking through, is this idea that recovery is not going to mean restoration. We're not going to, in a sense, go back to pre-pandemic times and just have like this reset where now life is normal, whatever we would have defined normal 6 months ago. Recovery is going to mean an adaptation to something new, something different. And when we think about it that way, we can start thinking about how do we want to direct this recovery? How do we want to, as local leaders in this broader community, steer our community to someplace where we'll ultimately be more prosperous, more successful? We must work towards community self-sufficiency. And then we put this kind of related thought, knowing that we're not going to get all the way there. None of us are going to likely manufacture iPods in our community. We're not going to put together computers and iPhones, but we can all grow our own local food as a starting point. If you take that spectrum of growing your own food to building your own automobiles or iPods, there are a whole bunch of things that are closer to growing your own food that we are capable of doing, that we could do, that we just don't do. And we just don't do it because someone else does that. And when you look at the idea of food, it's one of those things where, the notion of getting your food from overseas, having it shipped around, relying on workers that may not be able to show up because borders are closed or there's an outbreak in a certain place. What we have come to recognize very quickly is that our food system is very fragile. When we look at things like PPE, just basic masks. In the early days of this pandemic, we realized that, 98% of our masks are made overseas. We can't even make them here. We can't even respond to this thing in the way we would like to because, this stuff is made somewhere else. I bought a freezer in April. We started a garden this year and I bought a freezer because I wanted to be able to freeze our vegetables and have them over the winter. My freezer has yet to arrive. It was scheduled to arrive in May, and then they said back to June. Well, we're now in September, and it's scheduled for September 15th, but I highly doubt that I'm going to see it. We may not be able to manufacture freezers in our community. We might be able to fix ones that we have, though. And so there's a bunch of things in this spectrum that we can start to do to create our own resiliency, our own self-sufficiency. And oh, by the way, these things also employ people and create jobs. Finally, there's a trade-off between growth and stability. If you follow Strong Towns for any period of time, you know that we talk about this a lot. Economies that grow very, very quickly give up a certain amount of stability. You can think about it, the analogy we use is the difference between a person walking and a person riding a bike. If you have an economy that's like a person walking, a person walking can move ahead. They can also stop. Stopping doesn't make them unstable, but they can then, resume moving ahead again. A person on a bike must keep moving forward, and they must keep moving forward at speed. If for some reason they slow down, the bike becomes unstable and tips. We want our local economies to be more like someone walking, where there is growth and opportunity for growth, but also stability, as opposed to someone on a bike where it must keep going forward all the time at ever accelerating rates, otherwise things collapse. So how do we do some of these things? Some very specific things we can do right now to make this transition. First of all, if you have home occupation restrictions, just waive them, get rid of them. And I think, from a practical standpoint, most of our communities have anyway. We went to bed one day with nice zoning that put residential over here and commercial over here. And it was a very antiseptic kind of clean way of formulating a community, albeit I don't think it worked, but from a map standpoint, it was very clean. And now all of a sudden it's all messy because every neighborhood is a mixed use neighborhood. People are working from home. People are doing things out of their house that they weren't doing before. What this is doing is just recognizing what is there. And not only recognizing what is there, but recognizing that the world hasn't blown up. All the people who said we have to separate all these uses from each other and they can't ever mix or all chaos will break out, that has been proven to not be true. And so we need to lean into that and provide that flexibility for people to adapt to this and make better use out of their property. We need to, in conjunction with that, legalize neighborhood essential services. One of the things that we've seen is that when everybody in the community is forced to drive to the same centralized grocery store and walk through the same aisles and walk through the same place, when we all have to go to the same big box store, the same kind of thing, what you get is a very efficient vector for viral transmission. This is the concern that we're having right now with schools. We've built these very big schools because they were very efficient. We bring everybody there. Is this going to become a vector for transmission? There's some indications that it may. One of the ways we can start to adapt to this and change this that will also help our economy and make us more flexible in the future is to legalize some of these things at the neighborhood level. The neighborhood that I live in, the neighborhood right outside my window here at the office, used to have 13 grocery stores. It now has 0. There's one big box grocery store that way, and there's another big box grocery store that way. Now, the grocery stores in the neighborhoods were not big box grocery stores. They were a little butcher over here and a little baker over there, and they had specialty things. We had a little Norwegian place and a little Finnish place, and they were different, but they were scaled to the neighborhood. They were small. They didn't get a lot of traffic. They didn't have a lot of burden, but they provided an amenity for the neighborhood, and they were scaled to the neighborhood, and they provided a good job for people to work there. We can legalize these again, and I think what the pandemic has shown us is that there's very little downside to doing this. We can help kickstart entrepreneurs. There are tons of people in our community today that are both entrepreneurial and underemployed or unemployed. If you look at the photo I've got here, this is a street from Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon had a downtown that had a bunch of vacancies. And what they realized is that the cost of getting into those buildings was too high for their startup entrepreneurs. You had to go in and fix the bathrooms to be ADA compliant and put in sprinkler systems and do all kinds of stuff. And people who were starting out didn't have that kind of capital or access to that capital. They wanted to capture that entrepreneurial spirit. So what they did is they went out and bought a bunch of storage sheds. You can see here they painted them up and made them look a little bit nice. and they rent them out to people at ridiculously low rates, like $75 a month, $80 a month. They put them in a spot where people are walking by. They filled a street gap in it, so they kind of did some urban design stuff with it. What this has done is it's kickstarted their entrepreneurial community. You have people out here every day who are trying out new businesses at a very low stakes environment, finding ways to be of assistance to their neighbors. And ultimately what they've seen is that a lot of people have outgrown these little storage sheds and wind up with not only a proven business model, but also with the startup capital and the credibility to be able to go into one of those downtown buildings. We can kickstart entrepreneurs by lowering the bar of entry and providing them a platform to be able to try out their ideas. Legalizing home adaptations is another very simple thing that we can do today. You have a lot of people who are struggling to make their house payments, people who have lost their jobs, people whose spouse have lost their jobs. How are we going to stay in this home? We saw back in 2008 the concept of jingle mail, of people like literally just mailing back their keys to the bank, or getting kicked out of their homes and being foreclosed on. We've had some laws that have limited foreclosures, but those laws are expiring in many places. And even if they're not expiring in the next couple months, there is no way people can continue to stay in a place that they can't afford and can't pay for. One of the ways historically that people have stayed in places when they've suffered some type of tragedy or setback is to adapt that place for some of their income. I'll use a classic example. There are many examples in the past of people who were widowed, who then, instead of being out on the street and leaving their house, would turn their house into a bed and breakfast. And the extra couple bedrooms from the kids, or they would consolidate people into one room, they would rent out overnight and give people a little meal in the morning and send them on their way. It allowed them to stay in their house, have some revenue, pay their mortgage and their debts, and stay employed. There are a lot of big houses today where kids are off to college, or a family has more space than they need, where instead of losing that house or getting kicked out because they can't pay the mortgage, would be much easier to turn it into a duplex and allow them to rent out part of it. This is illegal in most of our zoning codes for no good reason. And we can give people opportunities to make better use of their property at no cost to the public. Make quick and lean investments in biking and walking. Again, this gets to the same kind of idea. People are driving less. In some places, driving is down 50%. Some of that is because we don't have places to drive to. Some of it is because people don't have jobs. The idea of being able to ditch a car, not use your car, go down to one vehicle is a huge price shift for people. It is transformative economically for people, particularly people on the low end of the income spectrum, to be able to not have to pay the ante of an automobile to participate in society. So things we can do to make biking and walking easier, quick and lean investments, things that would be done with paint, cones, straw bales, to make this easier, are all things that can shift that economic response and allow more people more options. It's time to end parking requirements. We've talked about this for a long time. The burden of requiring people to provide parking when they build a business, or provide parking when they build a home, in redundant to parking that is provided in other places, creates this huge economic obstacle to growth, to prosperity, to people fully participating in society. I have never been in a city in North America that doesn't have too much parking. And generally it's too much parking by a factor of 5 or 10 or more. We could do with, every time you see parking, you are seeing a use of space that generates no real revenue for the community, but comes at a tremendous cost in terms of the infrastructure that's provided and the lost revenue of that space. And so if we want to get cities going again, those storage sheds are way better use of space than requiring parking stalls. We need to think in terms of that. I mentioned growing your own food earlier. It's one of those ways we can just start to get a more entrepreneurial, more self-sufficient mindset at work. These places create good jobs. They create opportunity. That opportunity is broadly distributed. You don't need a PhD to start a garden. You don't need a master's degree to sell food. You know, and not only that, but what we see ultimately is that places that do this well create these feedback loops where now all of a sudden people are eating better. The restaurants are nicer. They're more valuable. People are able to have a higher quality of life. Thicken up our civic infrastructure is one of those things that I think often as local leaders, we don't value and appreciate as much. The communities that have done the best during this pandemic, but also during hard times of the past, are ones that have a broad civic infrastructure. At the local level, what this means are churches, synagogues, mosques. It means Rotary clubs and Lions clubs, volunteer organizations. It means, you know, places that are helping feed the poor and helping disadvantaged kids and helping mothers who have experienced distress, helping people through drug dependencies. These kind of infrastructure we often don't think of as essential. We think of, you know, the city out plowing the snow off the roads and keeping the parks clean, but it's actually that civic infrastructure that is the difference maker during hard times. We can support that. We can lean into that. We can rely on that. And as local leaders, we can be cheerleaders for those things. We can also begin reorienting our bureaucracies. I talked about orienting horizontally as opposed to vertically. I'm going to talk a little bit about that more in a second here, but that is an ongoing shift we can do within our bureaucracies to make them more responsive horizontally. And then change how you measure success. I put a link to a toolkit used in Pensacola, Florida, for measuring success. Oftentimes when we look at local government, we say, well, was it a good year? They'll say things like, how many permits did we issue? How many miles of road did we build? How many you know, pipes or pumps did we create? These are measurements of growth, but not necessarily measurements of wealth or success or prosperity. We need to change our measurements so that we're measuring things that are more applicable to our overall success. How many of our young people graduated from college? What was the delinquency rate amongst our young kids? How many people are, you know, in reading programs and early childhood things? How many people are going hungry? These are things that I think at a national level or at a state level become kind of mindless or silly statistics. At the local level, they're essential statistics, and we can measure them, we can use them, we can act on them, and it's very important to properly measure the things that are creating real success for us. Part of that orienting horizontally instead of vertically is going to be important when we get ultimately some type of federal stimulus money directly to cities. There's been a little bit in the CARES Act. Again, it was kind of clumsy. It was, you know, some cities found ways, innovative ways to use it. A lot of cities really struggled with it because it was so clumsy. There's been talk for years and years about major stimulus. It is my sense that if that is not done this year, it will be done at some point in the early part of next year. What we see in the past is that federal and state assistance is most likely to come to cities in the form of some big top-down infrastructure bill, generally targeting shovel-ready projects or something akin to a shovel-ready project. Understand what a shovel-ready project is. A shovel-ready project is a project that we went through the entire kind of birthing phase. We planned it, we put it together, we may even have put plans in place, and then we got to the end and we looked at how are we going to do this, and we realized that it didn't make sense. We weren't going to spend our money on it. It wasn't worth the sacrifice that we would have to make to do it. You know, we couldn't get a grant for it because it didn't qualify for anything else. So it just goes on the shelf somewhere. A shelf waiting for like the day when money rains down upon us. These are generally like the worst projects that we do. And so what we are trying to prep people on is when this money comes to you, we have to be prepared not to do the shovel-ready project, but to do the thing that is going to actually help our community. In general, if we can do projects that are below ground, they're better than projects above ground. If we can do projects that are maintenance as opposed to building new, you're going to in a better situation. And if we can target neighborhoods that are pre-Great Depression neighborhoods, as opposed to post-World War II neighborhoods, what we find is that the money that we invest there pays back multiple times over. And so as a guideline, if we're thinking about the types of projects that we would like to put forth in a stimulus bill, older neighborhoods, maintenance, underground are three like key factors that we can use to get the highest return out of that type of assistance. Oh, and that's what I wrote on this. I should have forwarded to this one. At least I said the right things, right, Rachel? Okay, so now we're setting ourselves up for the future. And what does the future look like? These are Strong Towns principles and the idea of building communities that are strong and resilient, something we've worked on here for quite a while. The principles are pretty clear. We rely on little bets, not transformative projects. We set up our cities to take many, many little steps in many different directions, not just go in and try to transform things overnight in whatever our current vision of success looks like. We emphasize resiliency and not simple efficiency. It's that idea of we can do things very, very efficient, but if we're doing the wrong thing, we're not being very helpful. We need to actually have systems that are, again, designed to adapt to feedback, building resiliency over time so that it's not a boom and bust cycle at the local level. We at Strong Towns emphasize relying on bottom-up action, emphasis on action, not top-down systems, emphasis on systems. So action from the bottom up as opposed to systems from the top down. We want us to focus on what are the urgent needs of people in our community? How are they acting? What are they out doing? And how do we respond to those struggles? As opposed to what is the system or the program that we can tap into that will allow us to do something. I'll give you just a quick example of this. In my community, the top thing that we're working on right now is a children's museum. Why are we working on a children's museum? It's not because we don't have lots of facilities. It's not because we actually don't have enough money to maintain the facilities that we have today. We've made lots of investments for kids, some of them good, some of them not very good. We have a school district that we just put $200 million into upgrading facilities on. So why is a children's museum the top priority? Like literally the thing that's on every council meeting and we talk about and we're working on. Because there's a grant for it. The state of Minnesota has created a grant program and they fund children's museums and we qualify for that grant. And so all of a sudden, all the air is sucked out of a room and everyone's focusing on a children's museum. What we would like the community to do is not focus on what you can get the grant for, what the program is that you can tap into, but again, reorient horizontally and focus on where are people in the community struggling. Does a children's museum answer the key struggles that people in the community have? Or have we taken the key struggles that people in the community have and interpreted those in terms of solving them with the thing we can get a grant for, in this case, a children's museum? Conduct as much of life as possible at a personal scale. Again, if you followed Strong Towns for any period of time, the highest returning investments that cities can make are ones that create environments where humans thrive, human habitat. They're scaled to people. If you said to me, Chuck, we've got $100,000 to make an investment, we can either do this big project or we can plant 10,000 trees. I guarantee you will have a higher return on investment planting trees than you will going out and doing something big and top down. When we scale things to people, when we scale things to something that you're going to notice or interact with walking down the street, existing in a place, those investments tend to be smaller and financially they tend to have many, many, many returns. When we scale things to people who access by the automobile, what we see is that we have to spend way, way more to do those projects. And in terms of financial return, most of those projects are actually negative returning long-term over multiple life cycles, as opposed to, they're actually making us poorer. And you'll get that by doing the math. Do the math is kind of one of our slogans. And if you follow Strong Towns, you've heard us say this many times. When we do the math, very interesting things, kind of things that we maybe weren't expecting come to the fore. So specifically, focus on your downtown. and an ecosystem of neighborhoods, the more we can look at our city as human habitat, as opposed to, some place that we just manage, but actually more of a complex ecosystem, a complex environment where adaptation is taking place all the time. The place we see that when we have a good core downtown, when we've surrounded that by neighborhoods, what we see is there's an interchange and an interplay between those two, where one improving affects the other, and there's a feedback loop back and forth. When we focus on those feedback loops, our investments are magnified many times over. In terms of regulation, focus on compatibility and not simply use. It's always astounding to me how you can go to a zoning code book and it will say, if you have if you are a painter, here's the thing you go through. And if you are an electrician, here's what you would have to do. And if you are, a carpenter, here's what you would have to do to open a business in this spot. And one will be onerous and one will be easy. And really, if you look at that, in terms of like what they do and how they interact with community, they're very much the same thing. We have developed these ordinances after World War II based on this idea of replicating a version of America over and over and over again. And these ordinances have not served us well in a time where we're not replicating as much as we're adapting. If we focus on neighborhood compatibility in our regulation, as opposed to use and kind of these rote standards of replication, we find that we can get that adaptability and our neighborhoods can become better places. I'll reiterate the housing options, the housing opportunities, not only allowing people kind of immediate capacity to make use of their property, but over time, allowing neighborhoods to grow, to adapt, to change. Anytime you put a neighborhood under glass, what you are doing is you're condemning it to stagnation and decline. Neighborhoods in healthy communities do evolve over time. That evolution is gradual and complementary. But the idea that we would have a single family home neighborhood and you would not be allowed to build a duplex in that neighborhood or add a accessory apartment or convert your garage into a rental unit, these things should all be by right, easy to do, very, very common. Instead of locking the neighborhood under glass and not allowing any change at all. Focus on transportation as a means, not as an end. Again, you're going to get inundated with opportunities to spend lots of money building lots of new stuff. There will ultimately be some type of stimulus bill, and that stimulus bill will not be focused on maintenance as much as the emphasis will be on what new will you build. That is a response to the economy. Our macro economy only works when we're building new strip malls, new big box stores, new residential subdivisions. So these programs that are stimulus programs tend to focus on that. When we look at transportation as something that is a good unto itself, we tend to make those bad investments. We tend to make those non-performing investments. When we look at transportation as something that is complementing what we're trying to accomplish in our community, we actually can make investments that pay off manyfold. Focus on economic development with a gardening mentality. There's a great program with the, I was going to say Kauffman Foundation. It's not. Just look up economic gardening on Google and you will get lots of information from this group. You can think of economic gardening as opposed to economic hunting. Economic hunting, let's go out and find the big business we can entice to move in. Economic gardening is saying, what is the businesses we have and how do we grow those businesses and grow complementary businesses? How do we look at the needs that people have in our community and meet those here locally? Again, this idea of self-reliance. Instead of, our goal should be, instead of finding one business that creates 50 jobs, we should take 50 existing businesses and try to add a job each. It's a very different approach. It's a very different mindset. It's one that is actually going to spend less money, but get better results. Focusing on leveraging public spaces, the idea that public spaces are not destinations we go to and experience, like a movie theater or a theme park in a sense, but places that actually are more integrated in the community, where like living next to that creates value and living 2 blocks away from it creates value. So when we're building public spaces, we're not only building them to be used, but we're building them to be radiate wealth throughout the community. Focus on people. Again, we're building human habitat. People are our indicator species for success. When we cue our decisions and our priorities off of the struggles that we see people having, as opposed to what are the traffic volumes over here, what is the grant we can get. When we focus on people in our community, what we find is that there's an infinite number of investments we can make that are small, low risk, but very, very high returning and impactful. And then ultimately, as cities, we do need to reduce our debts and our liabilities. Local government debt levels are at all-time highs. We are being encouraged and induced to take on more and more debt. There's a saying, it's never been cheaper to borrow. So go out and borrow whatever you need. Borrowing limits our future options, and oftentimes our view of what we can accomplish in a big top-down project with a big bunch of money is distorted by what we don't know about the future. If instead we discipline ourselves to work incrementally, to focus on the needs of people, what we can do without taking on huge debt, without taking on future liabilities, without obligating future generations to repairing a bridge every 40 years or fixing a road every 20 years or repairing a pipe or a pump every generation. Instead of putting that responsibility on them, we can actually free them up to have many, many, many options, as well as a city that is healthy, prosperous, and more successful. We have started a group called the Strong Towns Community. You can access that at community.strongtowns.org. It's a place for people to go meet other people from around the country that are working to build strong towns, working to implement a strong towns approach. I am there, Rachel is there, other people from our organization are there. The idea is to go be able to ask questions, be able to get answers, be able to find other people who are doing things similar to what you are trying to do, and then learn together from them. We also, in the very early days of the pandemic, started something called the Strong Towns Academy. You can get that at academy.strongtowns.org. We put together right away a Strong Towns 101 class that is available for free. The course goes through kind of the principles of a strong town, why we set things up this way. The idea of the Strong Towns 101 is not only to get new people up to speed quickly, but allow people who are interested in building a Strong Towns approach in their community to share these ideas with other people. You can share the Strong Towns 101 and get other people into it and build kind of a common knowledge set. So together in your community, you can start to work on things collaboratively. We are in the process of building out an entire series of courses around doing specific things. That first one, aligning transportation with a Strong Towns approach, is about halfway done. I've been working on it all summer. We're working on the housing one right now too. The other ones will follow over the next year. The idea is to walk you through creating a plan for your community with a Strong Towns approach. So if you want to know how to build a transportation system that aligns with Strong Towns, here's a course that will walk you through doing exactly that. You can get all those at academy.strongtowns.org. And then finally, before we switch over and take questions, the toolkit that I have been discussing is all available online. You can get it for free. If you go to strongtowns.org/toolkit, we will send it to you. You are free to use it, to print it out, to copy it, to share it with people, to distribute it, to copy and paste out of it, to use any part of it, to ignore any part of it. We put this out here as a free guide for people to help them do good things during this difficult time of transition. So with that, I'm gonna bring my colleague, Rachel, back. And just so everybody knows, Rachel was an instrumental part of putting this together as well. And so I'm gonna answer your questions, but I also may prompt Rachel to do some of that too, because she is quite knowledgeable, particularly in some areas that I'm not. And so, Rachel, what do we got in terms of questions?
Yeah, we've had a few questions come in, and we'll start with those. And feel free, as we are sharing here, to keep submitting questions in the Q&A as well. So this is a good starting point question from Kevin, who asks, what causes return on investment to be better when investing money in neighborhoods pre-Depression era versus post-war neighborhoods? So maybe we should say pre-war versus post-World War II.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, in a way, I'm looking here to see if I could call up a different presentation and a little thing real quick to kind of show some of this. It's interesting because I actually wrote a whole book that details a lot of why this is and why it works this way. The short answer that I give is it's complex, and that's very dissatisfying for people, because if there was like an easy way to replicate this, we would do that. I'm gonna share my screen again and show. This is kind of the classic example we use at Strong Towns. This is right outside my office here, a couple blocks behind me. This is a Taco John's. So what you're looking at here is 3 blocks in my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. These two here are the ones I want you to focus on. You'll see they're the same size area, have the same amount of public infrastructure invested in them. They are very different. That block on the left was built in the 1920s. As cities grew during that time period, they would incrementally grow they would incrementally grow up, and the buildings would become in place incrementally more intense over time as land values increased. This would have been the far edge of town. And so what this is like the little experiments. This is the next iteration of outward growth in this organically growing city in the 1920s. The block on the right used to look just like the one on the left. After these were built in the 20s, we had the Depression, we had World War II, we have a completely new style of development that skips over this and starts building hyper out on the edge. There's miles now of growth out on the edge. But these blocks have just sat here for almost a century now. The city had the one on the right torn down. They had all the buildings torn down, and then we got the new Taco John's. Here's the fascinating thing. That block on the left, that old and blighted block, has a total value of $1.1 million. Add up all those properties, how much are they worth? 1.1 million. That block on the right, it's the same size area, it's the same amount of public infrastructure. So in the sense, we are paying the same as a community to support this. The tax base is only 600,000. It's new. It looks good. It has got a double drive-through. It's got plenty of parking. It meets all the ordinances, all the codes. But from a tax base standpoint, the city's actually collecting 78% more taxes off the block on the left. This is a really stunning example, and I share it because it is, but this is a pattern we see repeated over and over and over again in cities. I'm gonna skip ahead to one in this presentation that I think is the most compelling, and I'll walk you through this one very quickly. This is Lafayette, Louisiana. What you're looking at here is the profit and loss, in a sense, of every property in the city. Everywhere where you see blue is a property that pays more in taxes and fees every year to the city than it requires in ongoing service and maintenance. Every place where you see red is the exact opposite. These are places that cost more to serve and maintain than they pay annually in taxes. The higher up the line goes, the more the disparity is. So what you have here in Lafayette, Louisiana, and basically we put this map together we spent a year with a group called Urban 3 out of North Carolina, going through all the budgets and costs and expenses and mapping this stuff up. This is a very, very deep and detailed study, but it affirms what we've seen in many other places. Here you have the core downtown of Lafayette, Louisiana. That's what this upper right photo is. In this area here, you've got this crescent of blue. These are properties that pay more in taxes every year and fees than they require in service. The bottom is a sample of that neighborhood. Very poor neighborhood, very old, very limited in terms of what is going on there. But from the city community standpoint, extremely profitable. They're making, the city is bringing in more money. These places are in a sense subsidizing these other places. This is the stuff that's in red. In the red, you've got the malls, the big box stores, the strip malls, the gas stations, the franchise restaurants, the cul-de-sac-y, new home kind of places. That's all the stuff in red. In the city of Lafayette, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order for the city to maintain everything that's been built, median taxes would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200. Essentially, what you have today is a situation in Lafayette where the city is functionally insolvent. They have expanded outward radically, taking on lots and lots of liabilities for sewer and water and road and sidewalk and what have you. As you accumulate those liabilities, the tax base has not been enough to meet that. And so the city is functionally insolvent. And the way they are hanging on is they're taking money from their oldest, poorest neighborhoods and transferring that money into sustaining the infrastructure out on the edge. That is a commonality we see in cities all across North America. And it's why when we're just giving a general guideline of where do we invest money, when you put your money into your older neighborhoods, when you put your money into fixing stuff that's underground, and when you put your money into, oh gosh, now the third one is forgetting my mind. Underground, not over, maintenance instead of building new. You're going to not always make the best investment, but if you just use that as like a guiding rule of thumb, you're more likely to stumble into good investments than not. And in a period where we're throwing trillions of dollars at problems, we're all just stumbling anyway. So try to stumble in a good direction. Does that make sense, Rachel?
Yes. Thank you.
I'll try not to be so long in the rest of them.
So next question is very simple, but a very good question from Ollie. How do we identify the urgent needs of our communities?
The urgent needs of, yeah. I'll work on this one, but then I want you to talk about it too, Rachel, if you don't mind. So I sat in my office for a long time, and I would look out the window and I would see people walking by day after day after day. They'd walk by all summer. They would walk by all winter. They would just walk back and forth and back and forth. The street they were walking down was 4 or 5 blocks of really road. There was a neighborhood on one side, and on the other side, another neighborhood. And these people were just walking from one neighborhood to the other, like dozens of people every day. In the winter, there's snow on the ground. In the summer, the cars drive really fast up and down here. There's no sidewalks. There's no street trees to provide shade. It's just a very open, kind of nasty place. I moved houses, and I started to walk this myself to get to work. I moved closer to my office. I walked to work. I would walk this every day, and it was horrible. I mean, it was just nasty. It was designed so the cars would drive by really fast. It was not very comfortable. It was kind of scary and dangerous. It also, in the rain, people would drive by and splash water on you. In the winter, the place where people would walk in a ditch. I mean, basically, you walk through the ditch. There's a path kind of worn through the ditch. The place you would walk would be covered with snow, and so you'd wind up having to walk in the street. And when a car would come, you'd kind of step into the snowbank. I started to ask people, where are you going? Like, I'm walking from my house to my office, but what are you doing? And I would walk with people and say, where are you going? What are you doing? And for the most part, it was people who lived in the south side of town, which is the poorest neighborhood, where the only grocery store in town was a little neighborhood grocery store that had closed. They were walking, almost all of them, to the north side of town, where there was a big box grocery store with a pharmacy attached, and also a little medical clinic. And so they were walking from their neighborhood to that neighborhood. It was about a mile and a half, but it forced them to walk through this 4-block stretch that was just horribly nasty. The city went out and redid that street. They went out and they redid it. When they redid it, I was kind of excited. I'm like, well, we're going to get something new here. They can fix this. I mean, clearly this is a problem. There's people lined up and down the street all the time. There's a path through the ditch because so many people walk through here. It became very clear to me very quickly that there was nothing going to be done. And when I talked to the city, they said, well, we're getting money from the state. There's a program that's come through. It's going to help us repave this road and fix it, but we don't have any money for doing the sidewalks. We don't have any money for doing anything else. Planting street trees, no, that doesn't meet the standard, bam, bam, bam. If we were focused on the urgent needs of people, we would be, instead of looking at what is the grant program we can get to fix this road, we would be looking at what is actually going on this road. The car volume is not that big. Even if it was, it could be handled in a much smaller cross section. The cross section itself could be retooled. We could put out cones, we could put out straw bales, we could repaint it, we could do something to give people a safe space to walk, or a more humane space to walk instead of through the ditch, instead of through the snow. We would be out planting street trees to give people a little bit of shade and a little bit of buffering from the traffic that's going through. At the very least, we'd throw some gravel out so that it wasn't such a difficult thing. It was clear to me in talking to everyone at City Hall that what they were focused on and what they were taking their cues from was the program that was in place to fund this road. And the problem they were trying to solve is, how do we maintain all the roads in the community? The problem that we should be trying to solve is, how do the people living in this neighborhood on the south side of town actually have a decent experience going about life? If you walk with people, if you observe where they struggle, if you actually have them, instead of inviting them to a public meeting and saying, what's your top 3 priorities? If you actually go out and experience the community with them, alongside them, what you learn is that the things that we tend to prioritize within City Hall, the programs that we tend to respond to and obsess over, the questions we tend to ask, are not very relevant to the people and their struggles within the community. And so by orienting yourself to focus on them and actually ask, what is the thing that people are struggling with, we actually create a whole different set of problems to solve. Rachel, I'm saying that inelegantly, but go ahead and if you have something to add to that.
No, I think you did a great job of talking about that. I mean, this is a topic that keeps coming up. We all, I'm sure, have experienced really broken and ineffective public engagement systems where some survey gets sent out and it's complicated and we don't even know what happens to the responses. But this is a question that we are very actively talking about at Strong Towns and continuing to look for good examples. My colleague Daniel just wrote an article, which I'll put into the comments this week on that topic, which might also direct you in some further thinking.
$2 million is what we spent rebuilding that road. And literally, you give me $20,000 and I can go out and transform, the walking part so that the dozens of people who walk through there every day actually don't have to struggle as much as they do now. And that's what we're really talking about. It's like, okay, well, great. We can get $2 million from the state to rebuild this road. That's delightful. It's the wrong question.
Yeah. I'm going to move to another question that's on a related topic. This question's from Adam, who writes, planning and zoning are technical fields. Strong Towns encourages flexibility and resilience. How do you suggest an average citizen without technical training engage their town and or developers to change the approach from post-war car-centric to people-scaled and walk-friendly? Where does the conversation start? Good question.
Yeah. You want to try that? You want to take that one first?
I mean, this kind of gets back to what we were just talking about. Is like, where does local governance and bureaucracy meet regular people who want to see positive change in their communities and just have their cities work better for them? Yeah, I don't know. Go ahead.
I feel like most people that run for office, one of the cycles that I see happen a lot is that people will run for office And they'll run for office with very like specific grievances or things that you know, motivate them to, like an injustice or something that is just not right. And those come from all over the political perspective, right? I mean, you may find this is wrong or that is wrong, or I want to fix this or that. And when they get in, they're often like force fed the priorities of the bureaucracy. You know, we have to maintain all these roads in this way. We have to put in these pipes. We have this grant we applied for 5 years ago, and now we're getting the money. So we have to do this project. We put this on the shelf 3 years ago, and now it's coming back. And so we're doing it. And you wind up working on a lot of projects and programs that you never, like, I had no interest in this. I had no desire to do this. This is not what I'm here for. And they either adapt or they quit or they, you know, become ineffectual. I think, to me, we don't have to work very hard to get public officials to care about this stuff. They automatically care about it. It's like the reason they went and did what they did. Local government, I mean, I'm just going to say this. There are a handful of people who run for local government thinking, well, then someday I'll be a senator and someday I can be governor and someday I'll, you know, there's a handful of people like that. The vast overwhelming majority of people who run for local government are doing it truly as public service. Like, I want my community to be a better place. And so I will also just go the next step and say a whole lot of people who work for government in a technical capacity are part of the bureaucracy, our professional staff. They also want to serve the public. I think what happens is that a lot of times serving the public in a professional capacity winds up filling a function and a role that becomes more system oriented, where running for office, you really want to be more human oriented. I think if you're an individual saying, I want my community to reflect Strongtown's values and approaches, I'm not getting that from my bureaucracies. I'm not getting that from my elected officials. I think what you need to do is join with other people to point out these things. I got the newspaper out when they were building that road, and I had the newspaper reporter walk with me and just look. I was like, look at the trail in the ditch here. Look at all the people. And we started to like raise that awareness about that and talk about that. And now, you know, it's 3 years after this project was done. We're talking about another project. And I tell you what, all the city council members are asking, who's out there looking at the, you know, who's out there? Are there people out there? Are we taking note of this? Are we going to fix this? They haven't gone back and fixed the one. That's a little too painful and embarrassing. But what we've done is we've informed them, and they're not going to make that mistake again. And so I do think it's about finding opportunities to, not as kind of a lone wolf, like I'm here going to complain, but how do we leverage relationships and networks and really the value of working together in a community? How do we leverage that to raise these issues and make them central to our consciousness, as opposed to, you know, wow, this is great, we got a $2 million grant to do this project.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. And like, local government is the best place to start. I'm sure even in pretty large cities, you could still get a meeting with your city council or any number of people who work on the city staff, especially if you're working with neighbors and you all go in to talk to that person together.
I know in like Los Angeles, where we have a lot of members and a lot of people that have done work, you know, the city itself is divided into like dozens of wards, and they have their own like structure and their own, because a lot of this stuff is hyper local. And you have to be able to deal at that scale to do things that are productive.
So let's go to another question. This comes from Gregory, who asks, how applicable are these strategies to small rural areas where there is sparse population density with limited economic growth and high levels of poverty? I think you might have something to say about that, Jim.
Yeah. Just so we're clear, the city that I live in is 13,500 people. You know, not a mega metropolis in any way. There are cities much smaller than mine and much poorer than mine. A lot of the thoughts and ideas, I mean, in my book, I'll pull this out We put this out last year, Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity. One of the critiques of the book that I've gotten a few times is that this only applies to small towns, not to big cities. I push back on that. I think that, fractal cities, big cities are fractal. They are a combination of many, many neighborhoods. And what we're really talking about here are neighborhoods. But when we get into a small town setting, what a small town is just a neighborhood. It's a young fractal that will ultimately, if it's successful, grow into a larger place. And so I feel like all of this is directly applicable to the small place, especially the place that is struggling. Because often those places that are struggling the most are being force-fed the bad top-down big solution. Here's how we're going to come in and do this thing, and it will solve all the problems. And those are the places that actually need to opt out of that system the most. They can't recover from those bad things. I was in, do you remember Chester, Pennsylvania? The article I wrote on Chester and then went to Chester a couple of times. This is a place where, like, literally, I think the poorest city in Pennsylvania. And that's saying something because there's some very poor old mill cities and all this, but Chester is like really, really poor. As an economic development tool for Chester, the powers that be at the DOT and at the state went in, and Chester got a brand new interchange on the interstate. They got a soccer stadium and a casino. I've been back to Chester 3 times since this was done. It was probably a decade ago that this was done. There's no change, there's no growth, there's no jobs. These things are like isolated things on an interchange for wealthy people to come in, go to a soccer game and leave. On the other hand, Chester itself, largely through churches, through local civic organizations, has started to build, a more community-focused approach. They're fighting the local government, they're fighting the state government. It would be better if they were all on the same page and trying to do the same, like, local things. The state's out trying to build interchanges, the local government's trying to build casinos and soccer stadiums. It would be great if everybody was aligned, but in the lack of that alignment, the best stuff that's going on in Chester is the stuff that people are doing at the block level. If you're a small town, to me, this is your approach to making your place better. And it's urgent there because there's not a lot of fallback, I think is the key for small towns.
Yeah. Okay, another question. We just have a few minutes left. So maybe if we have 1 or 2 questions, we can get to them before we wrap up. I can answer this one from Tina, who asks, I'm very intrigued by the storage shed businesses. I love the simplicity of the idea and the endless possibilities. Is there some place to find out more details on this? Yes, we have.
You wrote this story, didn't you?
Did I? Okay, it was a little while back. Yeah, so that particular example was in Muskegon, Michigan. They've had a very successful effort to create these small stores in their downtown, and other places have since been inspired by that and followed suit. So I'll post some links to those stories in the chat right now.
Muskegon was our strongest town winner of 2018. So every year we do a contest where we identify places that are doing really good work, and Muskegon won that contest in 2018. And they have a lot of things like this that we can learn from, where they've really, I think, done non-traditional things to great success.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was all our questions that we've gotten. I'll give like 30 more seconds if anyone has a final burning question to ask. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up.
Very nice. Muskegon, just so people know, Muskegon was a former very industrialized place that lost tens of thousands of people. I mean, they rapidly deindustrialized, and the city was gutted out and really had some difficult economic times. They have very much from the bottom up gone in and said, no one's coming to save us. We're going to have to do this with our own resources. And that means we're going to have to do it, incrementally. There have been some big projects they've done. I think that they have been a distraction from the things that they've done really well. A great farmers market, the storage sheds, the restoration of the downtown, a lot of the neighborhood housing development and connecting that to the downtown. I think one of the things that is most important to note about Muskegon is not only is their local government, I think, very good and very responsive, but the Chamber of Commerce is great and, very, very supportive. They have a lot of other civic organizations that have kind of joined in this process. They disagree sometimes and they have different points of view. And I'm not saying they all are in alignment, but I think they all agree on the idea that Muskegon can continue to get better, needs to continue to get better. And that the path to doing that is not some heroic savior kind of thing, but just a steady, let's improve this here, improve that there. Let's keep nudging this all forward in many different ways. And they've been wildly successful with it. Wildly successful.
Yeah, it's a very inspiring and very doable story.
Very replicable model, I think, is what I would call it. Nothing they have done is beyond the capacity of even the smallest communities, really.
Yeah.
So are we going to invite Andy back?
Yeah, Andy, I will hand it back over to you to close it out if you're still there.
Yay.
Yes, I am. Well, I think this is where we go through a handful of thank yous, and certainly Rachel and Chuck appreciate the effort for the presentation and the seamless work Rachel's doing behind the scenes. Like to thank everybody that participated on the webinar today, the different groups and individuals. And then lastly, again, I'd like to thank DRA, DLN, and Ameren, Illinois for their support. And unless you've got any last words, Rachel or Chuck, it was a great event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Just appreciate everybody being here and for the opportunity. And let's try to do something like this in person. I think these are, conversations that we need to have, and especially in your area of the world, there's an urgency to have that bottom up action be much more empowered. And so, yeah, I would love to get out there and let's plan on that. Hopefully next spring, huh?
You got a deal. And then just to remind everybody that we'll have a copy of this presentation in addition to the toolkit that we can share with everybody. So, all right, well, everybody have a great weekend, and here's to 2021.
Take care.